celebration of Jesus and Batman.
Batman?
Yes. Batman is very closely tied to the Easter tradition.
Okay, you're going to have to fill me in on that because that's news to me.
Well, it's rumored that, when Batman rises again, when the Dark Knight rises again, he will come back and save Gotham.
Okay, we're going to have to pause the video a minute while I beat Brian up for being an idiot.
No. Do it live. We need the publicity.
Yes.
But there's a point.
Hold on, I got stuff in my car.
I'm Batman.
No, you're not. If anybody here is Batman, it's me.
So what does that make me?
Batwoman.
Oracle. Not disabled, but you're the one in front of the computers.
Thank you for the clarification. Question mark.
I was going to say, you're going to make her the crippled Batgirl? I mean...
Well, no, but she's in front of the computers.
Yeah. So are a lot of people.
Yeah, but Oracle's cool. Batgirl's also cool.
Yeah.
You're like those non-superpowered kids.
He's Robin.
No, he's the non-superpowered kids that just hung around the Justice League. There's the one video of them on YouTube where they die horribly because like Darkseid shows up and the Justice League just lets him fight him.
Nice.
But more seriously, we are here to talk about Easter. We're going to talk about the origins. We're going to talk about the endless circulating meme that Easter is from the Babylonian deity Ishtar.
Yes.
And we're going to
proof that you can put anything on the internet, and
people will believe
it sounds remotely plausible or scholarly, people will jump on it and spread it.
And just because it's fun and we're not masochistic enough, we're going to talk a little bit about the historicity of Christ.
Hence the Batman thing. I'm trying to see if I can start a meme. I want to see how many people.
I think at this point that would be a nerd cult urban legend.
Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah.
And we'll see if they eventually make it canon. If it hasn't already been done, because
okay, maybe not. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it's not Batman. Maybe it's Superman because he died and rose from the dead, as well.
Yeah, Superman's the one that usually most shamelessly turns into a Christ clone, more or less.
But that's too much Mary Sue. I mean, I think most of our viewers like.
Batman is very much a Gary Stu.
Not as much as Superman.
No,
I'd argue more.
Yeah, actually, Superman.
We should have this argument at some point, but
Batman
might not be that night.
Superman has ridiculous powers, but Batman just becomes good at anything that the plot requires him to be good at. It's like, how in the world did Bruce Wayne cram in all of this training? And
Superman
all of this
has
learning?
actual weaknesses.
Exactly.
Batman's weaknesses, he's normal and not a superhero, but
yeah,
he kind of is a superhero.
Batman's weakness is
he has to
occasionally...
be a master of overcompensation because look at everybody around him.
Yeah.
He is the only normie.
Batman's...
But he's also a master of every single martial art in the world, a peak athlete in gymnastics,
and pretty much a human
a genius
computer,
detective.
and knows everything. Yeah, he's a ridiculous character. Actually.
But we're not here to talk about Batman. We're here to talk about Yeshua ben Yosef, also known as Jesus Christ or Jesus of Nazareth.
Yes, the original vampire.
Not a vampire.
Come on.
No, that was Cain. Cain is the original vampire.
He died. He rose from the dead 3 days later. What does that sound like?
But he didn't feed on blood.
All that talk about blood? No, he gave the blood to his disciples.
Yeah, but he
like
didn't feed on it. Vampires feed on blood.
Technically, by that logic, Lazarus would be the first vampire, not Jesus.
Okay.
And Lilith or possibly Cain would be the first vampire.
Well, that gets used a lot.
I think we're dipping back into White Wolf for a minute.
White Wolf is not that original. They didn't come up with
No, I
the
understand,
idea.
but that's the most common one.
Yeah, it's the one everybody knows these days.
I never heard of Cain being a vampire until White Wolf. Lilith, yes, not Cain.
Cain gets connected to everything, mostly because people make a big deal out of his curse, which might be an interesting... Curses in general, and the curse of Cain in particular, might be an interesting topic for another night. But yet again, we're getting sidetracked.
I'm doing you a favor. I'm getting all the weird, happy zombie Jesus Day stuff out of the way so that you can talk about the serious stuff afterwards. I'm getting all the goofiness out.
So why don't we start with the origins of the holiday Easter? I don't think I need to explain the entire resurrection of Christ to our listeners. I think most people listening probably know the Christian belief system and I'm not here to proselytize anyway. And again, I'm more at the this is a historical discussion. I'm not here to try to tell you that Jesus was. I believe, yes, I'm Christian. I believe Jesus was God and Son of God and all the other things Christians generally do.
No.
That's
and I don't.
Yeah.
So we're both well represented.
And the point is, that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. One, we're talking about the origins of Easter. The other, we're talking about, did Jesus exist in the first place? Because whether he was God or not, if he was a fictional character or a myth, then the rest is all moot. But him as a historical figure is something we can talk about from an academic, empirical sense without invoking the supernatural.
Okay. So that question that I had that I'll kick things off with, there's a certain amount of overlap between Easter and Passover. In fact, apparently some scholars and historians believe that the Last Supper was actually a Passover feast.
Well, it was. The Bible actually explicitly calls it. It says that when Jesus and his apostles came into the city, they were looking for somewhere to hold the Passover feast, and they were found. Ultimately, were able to use the house of Joseph of Arimathea. That is scriptural. So, and that's the Last Supper. That's the supper before he ultimately goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, is captured by the Romans and executed.
Okay. I had understood that there was some debate about that or whatever.
Strangely enough, there is, but I'd have to look up the exact verse. But the Bible explicitly says it was Passover.
Oh, well then that should.
Let me take a look. I'll look it up.
And that seems to be a weird thing to have, an argument about then.
But and for that matter, and here's a critical thing that gets into this Ishtar thing. The original name for Easter in Latin is Passa, P-A-S-E-H-A.
Yeah.
Passa in Latin is the name for Passover.
Right. Yeah. Oster comes from the German.
Yes.
And Ostara,
And Brian is absolutely right. That is
I did research.
Wait, really?
Yes.
It was bound to happen sooner or later.
No, I mean, he does have notes in front of him.
I don't.
He can't prove it.
I know.
We actually have to believe this?
But he got it right.
I read it.
Give
I read
him
it
the credit.
straight off the internet today.
He got lucky.
And he got it from correct website too. Now the interesting, so up until much later, the original name, and for that matter, in English we call it Easter. In German they call it Ostra.
Yeah.
In pretty much every other country in Europe, it's some version of Passover, because of course every other country in Europe is derived from Latin. Almost every other country.
Yeah, apparently there's also some controversy surrounding Ostara and Ostra.
You really did your homework.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have notes. I'm actually proud of Brian.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, because
really.
apparently a German, was it a German church member? I don't remember his rank. Bishop was the first one to write about it, and
do you remember when?
16.
Oh, earlier.
Or
than
no,
that.
600s, not.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
It was the 600s.
I forget the bishop's name, but you're 100% right.
Yeah, I couldn't pronounce it.
It's a bishop in the church in the 7th century, so 600s,
Yeah.
wrote about Ostra, which is, he refers to her as a Germanic deity of spring. There is some historical debate over whether she was a deity of spring or simply the feast that kicked off for the first day of spring, which of course just passed.
And supposedly this is where the rabbits come from.
Oh, there's that. Plus,
That gets really interesting.
Okay.
Plus, additionally, considering a lot of the celebration in and of itself, the Passover, which is what Easter corresponds to, is very much astronomical because it's all around the time of the equinox.
Yeah, there's
Yes.
controversy about that, the timing of Easter and where it actually falls on different calendars and this, that, and the other thing.
So the rabbits and the eggs.
Well, the eggs were interesting because I always thought that was something that was borrowed from pagans, but it turns out it is actually Christian.
They're actually not 100%
Ish.
sure. The eggs and the rabbits might have been borrowed by the pagans, from the pagans, or for that matter, there's actually some evidence that the pagans borrowed them from the Christians.
Okay. Yeah, because what I read was that the egg thing came from the egg representing the soul, and they were originally dyed red.
Yes, and sometimes the soul, or possibly just the egg, being birth, rebirth, and
Yeah,
Christ being reborn,
resurrection,
the resurrection. And certainly we know early pagans did use, of the first couple centuries, current era, or AD if you prefer, used eggs as symbols, but we know the early Christians in the same period were using it as symbols. And the records just aren't clear enough to go, okay, they did it first.
Yeah.
Well, there's also that a lot of the artwork that would have not exactly solved, but have at least origin-wise shown one way or the other in regards to certain deities, especially to various animals as well, have been lost because, well, pick your poison of who did all the desecrating, whether it was self-inflicting or what have you.
So that's what makes that so great. There was have you ever seen a movie called Angel Heart?
Yes, great movie.
Robert De Niro. Yeah, which is so great. The very first time you see Robert De Niro, he peels an egg and swallows it whole. It's just,
This is a reference to eggs.
it's wonderful symbolism,
If
and
you
it's
have
just
not seen
just
the
slips
movie,
it in there.
Angel Heart.
Oh my
See
God,
the
so
movie
good.
Angel Heart. And I don't want to talk too much more about
No,
the
but
symbolism of that scene.
brilliant.
Because we'd ruin what's so awesome about that movie.
Although it's not that subtle. I mean, he kind of, when you hear his name,
So
it's
once
sort
we
of like,
so once we see that scene, we can just cut out, right? We can just go peace.
nope.
No, the whole movie is awesome.
No,
It's
the whole movie's
absolutely
better. That's
phenomenal.
it's just you realize how brilliant it is later, after the reveal, when you see that was the scene that introduced him and the symbolism of that. But yes,
So back on
diverging eggs.
The idea
Easter bunnies.
that the eggs and the bunnies were attached to Ostra actually, believe it or not, comes from, do you know who? They're quite famous.
Oh,
Pair of brothers.
Oh yeah, the Grimm,
Yes,
brothers Grimm.
Jacob
when they,
and Wilhelm Grimm mention worship of Ostra in the 19th century and mention her association with rabbits and eggs. The original bishop did not mention either as being symbols of Ostra.
Yeah, no. Apparently, those were both parts of the Easter celebration already.
Yes.
So,
And you will find a lot of people who are absolutely convinced that these are hard. I've had very devout, sincere Christians yet screaming at me that dying eggs harkens back to blood sacrifices.
yeah.
And it's like, no, it doesn't. There's no record of this. This is myth.
Well, and part of what I wanted to prove with this, from my point, is people educate yourself.
Yes,
I went on frickin' Wikipedia, typed in Easter,
And found this
read the damn article, linked over and just for completeness went over to Ostra, and read that, and boom, there it all is. You can research it further and check things out and double check things, but it's not like this is difficult information to find. Is what I'm saying. It's not hard to disprove a lot of these ideas.
And since the very beginning, one of my mottos in doing the show has been, don't take my word for things, do the research for yourself. And Brian is 100% right.
Yep.
Don't take my word for it. Don't take the stupid memes word for it. And I'm going to get to that in a minute.
No, never believe a Facebook meme on its own.
Don't trust popular opinion. The popular opinion is, that all this stuff is pagan. Do some research. Educate yourself. Because just because everybody knows something doesn't make it true.
Yeah. I mean, certainly some things are pagan and borrowed.
Oh, absolutely.
And some things were stolen, but
and some things the pagans
it
borrowed
becomes,
from the Christian.
Yeah, it becomes too easy to take that and make the leap to, oh, well, if certain things were borrowed, well, let's just say everything was stolen or everything was borrowed. That's lazy. That's, you want to look into where did things actually come from and what history do
anyone
they
who's
have.
watched the show for any length of time knows, even as a Christian, I'm not shy about admitting large parts of particularly popular Christian practice have pagan roots. So, when we talked about Christmas, it's like, your trees and your Yule logs and a large part of Santa Claus, all of this is pagan origin. There's no denying that.
Yeah, and a lot of it's a lot more recent than people tend to think. They think these traditions are ages old, and some of them are in Germany, but everywhere else.
And in point of fact, just like if everyone remembers when we talked about Christmas, our idea of Santa Claus largely in the United States largely comes from the Germans.
Yeah.
Who settled specifically in New York, Sinterklaas. Our idea of the Easter Bunny also comes from the same group of Germans.
Yeah.
They called him the Osterhase.
which is just so much cooler than Easter. Osterhaus. It just sounds like he could be played by Arnold Schwarzenegger in a movie now, you know? I am the Osterhaus. I'm coming to find your eggs. Praise Jesus.
That just reminds me. There's a great old skit from, I want to say, In Living Color.
Oh yeah, that was a
where
good show.
Arnold's sent back, where the Terminator is sent back in time to protect Jesus.
Oh yeah.
So you have this wonderful sequence of he goes up, he just shotgun blasts.
Yeah, just walks in and shotguns Judas, like just
And Jesus is
straight
like,
up.
no, I need him. Heals him. Shoots him again. Heals him.
Yeah,
And as I've said
that was
before
a
in the
good
show,
show.
God's got a sense of humor. I have hope I'm not going to hell for having a little bit of fun over this.
Well, you and Martin Scorsese, right on the same bus.
So, the Ishtar meme that's been circulating, for one, I have absolutely no idea where it started. I have a suspicion.
I'm betting you it was somebody that literally just sat down and said, "Hey, Ishtar kind of sounds like Easter, when it's pronounced, in the original way." It's like, I'll
there's
bet
something
that's
about
where
how it's pronounced.
It's like, I'll bet
It may have
that's
been just Ishtar, or it may be Ishtar.
Ishtar or Easter. Yeah,
There's
it sounds
debate.
vaguely like it. So,
Yeah.
so somebody went, "Oh my God, that's where it had to come from."
Well, I have a slightly different theory, and I may be wrong, because there's a crackpot that we're going to get into once we start getting into the historical evidence, named DM Murdoch, or as she used to call herself, Akira S.
You're giving this lady way too much free airtime. I'll tell you that.
No, this is the time
For somebody that is so obviously and clearly wrong, I would
you
not.
have a point.
I would not even
And I
talk
think this
about
is
it
the
that
point
much.
I'm going to drop. This is the point of putting it to bed.
Yeah,
But
when
a
somebody
lot of this nonsense, she
as
has a
soon as
lot to
somebody
do with
says-
a lot of this nonsense.
yeah, as soon as somebody says Dionysus was like the only son of Zeus, I'm like, I'm out. Yeah, no.
Oh, and trust me, that's the beginning of the
It's
stupid.
like, I'm sorry, I knew better than that in second grade.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole series of claims made. There's a conspiracy that we're getting to called the mythicist movement, which Jesus was a myth, he never existed. She's one of the most prominent figures of the 20th century in that movement, which is why she comes up a lot. And hopefully we're going to put that to bed probably towards the second hour. So Ishtar, again, on point, is...
I'm trying. I'm holding myself back from tangenting because I thought of something really funny, but I'm not saying it.
Okay, Beth, make a note. I need a riding crop so I can just whack him every time he gets out of line.
I have a riding crop.
I don't want to know why.
I do have one, but
It's only for private use.
no, I just can't remember where I put it.
Wow, that's worse.
Okay, find the riding crop. We'll keep Brian improperly in line.
I'll just start
That should
sitting
be
further. I'll just start sitting out of your reach. That's all.
He doesn't have to get up. I just have to come out front.
Yeah, I just have Beth do it.
I can dodge you.
My buddy's on Beth. I'm sorry, Brian, but my buddy's decidedly on Beth.
I'm gonna start bringing a shield.
This is gonna
Oh,
get
he thinks he
funnier.
has the dex check for that.
Yup. Armor class, baby.
You have an armor class, I think, of what, about -10, and that's in
No, I'll be generous.
third
I'll
edition.
I'll be generous. I'll give him a
Your
2.
negative's bad.
Well, we're not going second ed, but I'll be generous. I'll give him a 2.
That's my dex check. Certainly. That's why I would wear armor.
Well, no, your dex check is clearly a -3.
Oh yeah. Well, of course, 2 is would actually be awesome in second edition. It's terrible. in fifth.
This is true, but since we're not going by second ed,
Yeah.
we're going by third.
Okay, so now that we have fully tangented, I'm gonna.
And this is my fault. I
Yup.
can't even blame you.
Exactly. I'm gonna say what I was originally gonna say. I just imagine being a member of the mythicist movement with a lisp.
Oh God.
I'm a myth. I'm a myth.
So
I know it's terrible.
Ryan is a horrible human
yes.
being. If
Call
you didn't know that yet.
call in and tell us how horrible we are.
So Ishtar was a Babylonian goddess, possibly Ishtar, possibly Easter, or Ishtar, not Easter. No, I'm doing it. Nobody's really sure. She's the goddess of fertility and war.
And a terrible movie by with Dustin Hoffman and Warren Beatty.
Really? I didn't know there was a movie.
Oh God, yeah. Well, that was infamous. Back in the '80s, that movie tanked like nothing had tanked before it. It was supposed to be this big hit comedy, and it just.
So, yeah. In terms of her connections to Easter, let's see. It's pronounced Ishtar, or again, possibly Ishtar, E-E-S. Her symbols are the lion and the 8-pointed star, not the rabbit and not the egg. And she's a Babylonian deity who pretty much worship of her had died by the point of the 1st century AD. As far as I know, because Babylon wasn't a thing anymore. I mean,
didn't survive into like Persia or any of that.
Well, by that point, Persia would have been Zoroastrianism, which is a really interesting dualistic religion.
You've mentioned that one before. That one has a lot in common with Christianity and so.
Oh yes, it does. And in point of fact, Zoroastrian priests showed up at the door of baby Jesus. We know them as the Magi.
Though that actually just something that makes me sad is the fact that one of their traditions, for those that still practice Zoroastrianism, they can't do it anymore because one of their burial traditions, which is leave the bodies for the vultures because they're dying off because of expansion. That makes me sad.
That is unfortunate. Yeah, Zoroastrianism, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know, is still a thing. It's not a widespread religion these days, but people do still practice it. It holds 2 deities, both usually thought to be brothers, Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. Ahura Mazda is the god of good, Ahriman is the god of evil. They both have a series of demigods and or angelic type servitors.
Yeah. See, now if you want to start out religions that I do think Christianity borrowed something from, that's probably one.
And that's probably fair, to be completely honest.
I'm sure there were elements that influenced that because there's just too many coincidences or too many similarities to be completely coincidental. And it was in the right region.
Right region, right time.
Yeah.
The Bible itself said the priests showed up to visit Jesus and brought him gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
So there you go.
Although not on Christmas, not on the original Christmas. It was a year or so later that they actually showed up.
Yeah. Well, because that never made, well, I guess if you buy into like prophecy and stuff, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense that you just happened to get there at the very, like day he was born or something.
Essentially, they were astrologers following astronomical signs that suggested this important birth had happened. There's a whole lot of historical debate over what the Christmas star was. It may have been,
right.
And there are actually a number of contenders that would have been very bright in the area of Bethlehem at the right time, around 3 to 5 BCE, which is when Christ was actually born. One of which would be Halley's Comet. Another is a astronomical conjunction of like 3 or 4 planets that made a very bright star that was visible in the area. Now, knowing, and we know, I mean, this isn't me just making things up. We know from historical records that the Magi were astrologers. You know, a conjunction, or for that, especially a comet, would have been seen as a sign of great importance. It's not a giant stretch that they went looking for some special birth. And oh wait, your kid was born a year ago when this was going on.
Yeah.
Especially when you add further, your kid was born a year ago when this is going on. Oh, and you are an actual legitimate heir to the house of King David, just like prophecy said.
There we go.
Granted, especially when you deal with, I hate to say it as a Christian as much as I want to believe it, all of the Gospels. The earlier in the Gospels you get, probably the less reliably information is. Because the thing to keep in mind is, all of the Gospel writers came much later. None of them were there for the birth of Christ.
Well, obviously, yeah.
Word of mouth and condensing everything down. That's why some of the epics,
Well, yeah.
like everybody
there's
dissects it.
And there's actual like contradictions in some of the things.
Oh,
where
yeah,
one
sorry.
gospel says one thing and the other one says it a different way and says it happens differently.
Most of which could be explained. There are a number of contradictions. Some very small ones, like Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek," or Jesus said, "Blessed the meek are blessed." Some are more
Well, yeah.
significant, like how many people were at the opening of the tomb? Did Judas Iscariot hang himself, or did he throw the money down in the temple, or did he use it to buy a field that he hanged himself in? Different gospels give different accounts of this. A lot of which, in my personal opinion, come down to you're dealing with eyewitness accounts. And in some cases, particularly in the case of the Gospel of Luke, you're dealing with a collection of eyewitness accounts. Because, so the four Gospels, since now is probably a good time to start getting the historical side of this. So you have the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Two Gospels are, according to tradition, written by the actual apostles, so they're first-hand accounts. One of the Gospels is written by the secretary to Peter, who, of course, as a fisherman, would have been illiterate, most likely. And of the two Gospels, I want to say Matthew was written by a tax collector, so he actually probably would have been literate. And then, of course, there's the Gospel of Luke, which was written by a physician, and most historians now agree what actually happened is it's not a first-hand account. He collected a series of first and second-hand accounts from around the time period and tried to condense them using what scientific knowledge he had at the time, which is why you find he's the one who gets a little more precise about what Jesus was healing people from, because he was a physician, he would have understood that. So that probably, that's what you're dealing with. So the question does become: was Jesus an actual person, or was he make-believe? A lot of mythicists, at least a lot of dishonest mythicists, will tell you that there are no non-Christian references to Jesus, which is a load of horse manure. The most prominent probably would be Josephus, who was a very important Jewish historian of the first century. He wrote around 60 A.D. He mentions Jesus twice. Now, the first of the two mentions is almost certainly a forgery. Most historians agree, Christian or otherwise, agree it's a forgery, particularly because it calls Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. Mm-hmm. And Josephus, as a believing Jew and an outspoken critic of early Christianity, would never have called Jesus the Messiah.
Right.
But the second one, most historians think it's probably actually legitimately written by Josephus. Aside from Josephus, because there's the mythicist idea that basically the Jews kind of cooked the whole thing up, which we'll get into in a minute, but
which is a funny group to
given
what happened afterwards, to say, oh, it was all a Jewish conspiracy,
especially why it was supposed to be a Jewish conspiracy. So yeah. the one prominent theory is that basically a group of Eastern mystics and Jews and Romans got together and invented this character to stabilize the Roman Empire. Why would an oppressed people like the Jews want to help their oppressors? And if that's the case, why were the Christians pretty brutally persecuted by the Romans for the first nearly 300 years?
Yeah.
Before the reign of Emperor Constantine. It's a ridiculous theory. I mean, setting aside everything else about mythicism, the idea that idea is ridiculous.
And not knocking like early Christians too much, but to be fair, Constantine wasn't the most sane guy on the planet.
No.
And funny enough, he wasn't really Christian until his deathbed.
Yeah. No, he did a lot of stuff. He did a lot of stuff that would not be considered very.
So I converted. No.
Yeah.
No, he converted on his death. There is actually, people say Darwin converted on his deathbed. It didn't happen. Constantine actually seemed he didn't decant. Both are myths.
Yeah.
Constantine actually, as far as I know, seems to have converted pretty close to his deathbed. But the big thing he did that was important is he legitimized Christianity and made it legal to be Christian. So the Romans were no longer actively persecuting them. He gets a lot of credit for the Council of Nicaea, which is the group that got together and decided, okay, which of the many Gospels that existed at the time are we going to include in the Bible and which are we going to throw out? This has led, of course, to the many, we talk with our friend Bishop Laney last week about the Gnostic Gospels, the so-called lost Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas.
The Gospel of Batman.
It's coming.
That's the one I want.
Is that going to be like before or after the Winchester Gospel?
After the Winchester Gospel, before the RoboCop Gospel.
The Gospel
can
of
accept
RoboCop, yes.
Because RoboCop is also shamelessly a Jesus
Oh yeah.
stand-in.
Oh well, yeah. No, I mean Paul Verhoeven even mentioned it, although he meant it as more of a satire. Apparently, he was sort of poking fun at the idea because Paul Verhoeven is a rather outspoken atheist, I believe, and I listened to the whole commentary on RoboCop, and it was amazing.
I have a slightly off-topic question.
Sure.
Now, my extent of reading the Bible is my first Bible, which every child in my dad's side of the family got.
I got one too.
And the picture Bible. So, where does it actually go? Because this was something, because I was rewatching Dogma recently, because of course.
It's a great movie. I love it.
It's an amazing movie. Where are the missing years? Because, as is pointed out, he goes from 12 to 30.
Supposedly, there's a lost gospel that actually dealt with Jesus' teenage years, where he accidentally resurrected some guy.
And it's not one of the Gospels. This is actually a good example of what I'm talking about with non-Christian discussions of Jesus. So there's a collection of writings known as the Babylonian Talmud, which you have the Torah, which is the 5 books of the first 5 books of the Bible, which is major Jewish holy books, and then you have the other books, the Tanakh, which make up the rest of the Jewish Bible. And then you have the Talmud, which is a series of commentaries that have been written over centuries by various rabbis. The Babylonian Talmud comes in around sometime in the first 300 years since the death of Christ. It was written over the period, so it's not like, it was written. We don't know when it wasn't written at one time. It was written over a course of hundreds of years. Now, it actually mentions Jesus. It mentions the lost years. It particularly mentions a story, as I recall, of a baby bird flying into a window to something to that effect, breaking its neck, and Jesus healing it. The story, it actually, despite being a Jewish text and not being Christian at all, it does talk about Jesus performing miracles. And now, having read it from talking to some of my Jewish friends, Jesus comes off as a little bit of a snot-nosed kid.
Yep. Which a lot of people argued was why it didn't get included. I have that book, Lost Books of the Bible.
Well, it's not really a book of the Bible. Talmud's never been a book of the Bible.
Yeah.
But to get to your question, so we know about the stories going up to around age 12. Of course, a famous story of him in the temple and correcting the rabbis as a child. And then his family is warned in a vision to flee because to Egypt, and then he reappears when he's 30. The only thing we know from the Bible is that he wound up in Egypt for a while, because again, it was the family's told to go to Egypt. Beyond that, there's no concise record of what happened to him. There's rumors of him going to Asia and learning with the Buddhists or teaching the Buddhists, depending on who you ask. There's rumors of him going to England, and a whole series of other stories of him going all over the world. And
which some of those could just be misdirection in case anybody was hunting him.
Yeah, and I think quite a lot of it's just legend.
Yeah.
And another common thread you'll see with a lot of the mythicist arguments is, well, there are certainly undeniable similarities between the story of Buddha and the story of Christ. Jesus was born of the house of David, the true proper ruling house of Israel. Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, the man who would become Buddha, was born of the Brahmin caste, which is the highest class in Hindu society, and the rulers. Supposedly, in fact, he was born of the richest of all kings. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert, wandering, was tempted by Satan. Buddha spent 40 days in the wilderness, meditating under the Bodhi tree, and was tempted. I forget the being's name, but it's basically the incarnation of desire and pleasure in Buddhism. He's not Satan. He serves an actual beneficial purpose. He's not seen as wicked, but he still serves a very similar tempting role. There's also the figure of Krishna, which is from the Bhagavad Gita, who was this great warrior who was the living incarnation of the god Vishnu. And there's some similarities there. The biggest differences there being Krishna was a warrior. He died in battle when he was shot in the eye with an arrow. Some mythicists claim that he actually was nailed to a tree, which of course Jesus was crucified. In some places in the Gospels, it talks about him being nailed to a tree. The reality of which being, say, in first century, saying someone was nailed to a tree would be like me saying somebody did dance at the end of a rope when they're hanged. It's a
Slang.
euphemism.
Yeah. Well, and also people forget that, well, not forget, but some people don't know that crucifixion was a pretty common punishment at that time. It wasn't like some special thing that got reserved for certain people. It was like, no, it was like a very common.
Everybody got crucified.
Oh yeah,
Well,
it was a major,
Romans had,
Roman way of executing people.
Romans had very specific. They had different kinds of executions based on your crime, and a lot of them were things. But like adultery, adultery was an especially bad one. You got sewn into a sack with like a rooster, a dog, a snake, and thrown into the river.
Okay, let's see. Brian's been a good boy this week and done his homework. Let's see if he knows this one.
Test time.
Do you know what Jesus was crucified for?
Proselytizing without a license.
Beth, you know?
I know how he got chosen to get executed because they let a murderer go.
Yes, Barabbas. The crime is on the top of almost every crucifix you've ever seen in your life. INRI, which is Latin for I use this. There is as we all remember from Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail. There is no I in Latin.
Last Crusade, Holy Grail is Monty Python.
Yeah, good point. I'm sorry, you're absolutely right. Shame on me.
Yes.
Very much so. May Sean Connery come stalk you in your sleep.
I use this. Nazareth. Rex Iudeum, which to translate that into English is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. He was, if I'm even read the Gospels, he was claimed by many of his followers to have been a political leader of the Jews being under the rule of the Romans at the time weren't supposed to have a king other than Herod. Yeah. He was basically it was a political maneuver by the Romans. There was. People say, oh, the Jews killed Jesus. The Pharisees, which were a sect of Judaism, had a role in it, but the Romans executed him. And the Pharisees are not they were not necessarily the most popular at the time or now.
Well, Jesus, I mean, because his whole religion was kind of starting trouble for a lot of people.
True. So, okay, we've covered, again, to get to a point I wanted to make. Or back to a point I was trying to make, I should say. You have the writings of Josephus. You have the Babylonian Talmud. You also have Tacitus, who was a Roman politician in the first century, right around 100 A.D., and Pliny the Younger, all of whom mention Jesus. And what's critical here is, okay, when you want to talk about the Gospels, they were written by Christians. They're a biased source. Doesn't mean you dismiss them entirely, but grain of salt. Yep. You want to talk about the writings of because aside from the Gospels, which were written probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 A.D., and we know the books of the Bible as we know them were largely accepted by most Christians by 95 A.D. By the way, Nicaea just kind of did stamp of approval, but. The early leaders of the church in the 1st and 2nd century, many of whom wrote about the apostles, had known the writers of the Gospels personally, quote the Gospels that we accept extensively. There's actually a school of thought that you could probably reproduce the entire Gospel, with the exception of maybe 11 verses, just from quotations in the 1st and 2nd centuries. But again, these are biased sources. Now, Josephus was a Jew and an outspoken critic of Christianity. Tacitus and Pliny were Romans and outspoken opponents of Christianity. These were people who had an active bone to pick with the Christians. They had no reason to lie. And they all reference Jesus as a historical figure. Now, they're not detailed records, because let's face it, especially writing with, decades after the man's death, the man himself wouldn't have been as important to these historians as what his followers were up to now, because...
Well, yeah. Also, it's important to remember that the Romans had a different view of the purpose of like a historian than we do now. They weren't as concerned with objective facts. So the Roman historians, you also have to take them with a grain of salt, but for different reasons, because generally
Romans were clickbaity as hell.
Well, they were also writing with a political agenda.
Which is even more reason for them to say that that if they had any reason to think it, or thought they could get away with it, to say, "Oh, this Jesus guy never existed."
Yeah, Tacitus was writing his, his stuff with an eye toward, sort of polishing the apple of the person that's currently. It's like Shakespeare. His version of history favors the family that was currently in power, because
he was politically savvy.
Because that was the smart thing to do. If you wanted to get royal patronage and you wanted, the queen to come and watch your plays and enjoy them, you were going to speak nicely about her. About
how wonderful her family was and all her ancestors.
Exactly.
We're over the half-hour mark where I usually give it out, so I do want to give out the number again: 609-807-2492. 609-807-2492. Most of the stories were, Jesus gets connected to a lot of various pagan deities. He's been connected to Dionysus, in the most absurd way, because only begotten son of Zeus, which is like, I'm sorry, pick up any book ever written on Greek mythology.
I think somebody just went, well, Jesus had something to do with wine.
Yeah.
And this guy Dionysus had something to do with wine. Obviously, there's a connection.
But so many people who should know better take this source seriously.
Oh, I know.
And
it's like so many things in the world.
So I can finally put this axe I have to grind to bed, because the woman is dead.
No.
There we go. Akira S., a.k.a. D.M. Murdoch, was not a historian. She is not a theologian. She has no qualifications. She was not fluent in any of the ancient languages. All the ideas that she put forward, she picked up from 19th century pseudo-historians, all of whom have long since been debunked. Another great example is he gets connected to Horus from Egyptian mythology, because Horus supposedly had 12 disciples. No, Horus had 4 disciples. Supposedly cast out demons.
Not quite disciples.
Yeah, but there weren't 12 of them either.
Well, there weren't 12. However, considering with any pantheon how, kind of way to put it, interwoven everybody was.
Yeah.
Because depending on who you're speaking to, the 4 that you are referring to are his sons, or they are also additional brothers.
Yeah.
That's why they're on the canopic jars.
True, but I'm trying to give the mythicists as much credit as I can to say 4 disciples. This just makes their case even worse when it's like they were brothers or other sons.
You're welcome.
And Beth is absolutely right. In fact, to be completely fair, I was not aware of that. Beth knows Egyptology better than I do.
Yeah.
Supposedly, he was also baptized by Apsu the Baptizer, which is a figure that first appears in the 19th century and doesn't appear in the Book of the Dead or any other historical Egyptian writing.
Right.
He didn't exist. He was made up to further make this mythicist connection. And if anyone wants to say I'm wrong, I invite you to find me academic sources and scholarly journals that confirm any of this.
I like the one that...
Are you going on about Mizra again?
Oh, Mithras.
Mithras, yeah.
Mithras.
What was actually hilarious is the closest I was able to find to that specific deity.
Mm-hmm.
Believe it or not, was actually in Heroic Legends of Arslan, which is an anime that was based off of a book series that was based off of a 19th century writing of an epic that was written as a present for a sultan at that time. I haven't found anything other than that, but then again, my Google foo is complete crap.
Well,
but that's also what I was able to find, because one of the characters is actually a cleric, a warrior cleric of
Mithras.
that day.
Well,
Mithras
Mithras
were,
was a
Mizra.
yeah.
We know almost nothing about the cult. So here's the thing: we know almost
it was a
nothing
secret
about
cult.
the cult because it's a mystery cult. It's
Yeah.
secret.
And it was mostly based for soldiers. He was pretty much kind of a god of soldiers that that they could pray to, and they had their little secret societies and whatnot in Rome.
The closest thing when it came to like mystery cults and whatnot, because there has been rumors with things such as the Magdalene manuscripts as well, which that's one of my more favorite, even if it's rumor alone, enough just to make, if for no other reason than to make people actually think about it for a minute. There was this rumor going around about the cult of Isis, and part of that was that Mary Magdalene wasn't a whore; she wasn't a prostitute,
Which is biblically accurate, by the way.
which is. But that she was a priestess of the old ways, specifically Isis. And one of the theories that tied along with this was that Jesus was, according to this rumor, again, was a priest within this cult, specifically for tantric magic.
Which would be Hindu. What's tantric magic doing in the Middle East?
Yeah.
Considering their trade routes and all the syncretism that was going on prior to then, especially among
it seems
the
like
upper noble, which wouldn't have surprised me considering they kept up the tradition of God's wife up until the fall under Cleopatra, because she was the last recorded God's wife in position. Just like a lot of different tectonic shifts within various religious institutions under certain pharaohs and such.
That raises the question of how much of it is syncretism and religions borrowing off of each other, and how much of it is, for lack of a better way of putting it, convergent evolution within religion. There are common themes in religion all over the world, including religions that didn't have contact with each other at the time, that, and I'm not even necessarily saying, oh, this is proof of some supernatural influence. It's because, certain archetypes seem to have a psychological resonance with people without having hardwired into our DNA by evolution. The idea of the old wise man shows up all over the world.
Yeah. The old wise woman.
Yeah, or
the wise elder in some aspect,
elder,
typically, or somebody who was at least young but still far ahead of their years, or the concept of old souls. Additionally, even by methods of praying as well, like the traditional way that anybody who was raised with any kind of Christianity is taught to pray is you kneel, you put your hands together. Whereas that in and of itself just seemed like I was banging my head against the wall until I learned meditation and actual connection. Some things don't jive. So it's completely possible that it's not so much syncretism in certain respects. And not all. Some of it is blatant syncretism.
Oh, yeah. No, we're not denying that.
But then there's also, like for certain slower spreads of various ways of worship, where it's a matter of this seems to gel more with certain people that have this potential proclivity, so they make room for it.
Well, people borrow stuff. I mean,
this is definitely a subject. We're down to like 13 minutes, and it's like, this is a subject worthy of discussion unto itself, in my opinion.
Yeah, we could
not to try and dismiss it. It's just like, no, this is too interesting to just.
Well, the whole thing of religion and history, it kind of goes beyond the scope of that. So yeah, we could do a different, like a whole day.
I do want to address the.
Well, we don't have our normal timestamp tonight, so.
Oh. Thank you.
Uh-oh, now you've done it.
So
now you've done it.
Let me touch on the ISIS connection with Mary Magdalene, because I actually find that idea interesting and possibly at least somewhat plausible. Because here's the thing: the Bible does not call Mary of Magdalene a prostitute anywhere.
Because that descriptor didn't happen until like 14th century.
No,
or a little earlier.
Well, or whatever you want to call it, there definitely was an idea of a prostitute at the time, and there is another Mary that's mentioned in the Bible that is referred to as a prostitute.
So, yeah, a lot of people think I keep saying a lot of people, but I've seen things and read things that say that Mary might have actually been more of like an advisor to Jesus and kind of an equal of among the apostles.
These are all really interesting ideas. There is actually something I'm getting with you. So what the Bible does say about Mary is that she was possessed by 7 demons. Now, she knew Jesus was going to be there, and she thought, if she could reach out and just touch his robe, she'd be healed. The demons would be cast out. She does this, he feels part of his holiness drain away, for lack of a better way of putting it, and turns to speak to her. Now, the idea that she is a prostitute, that she got basically Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and another Mary who's given no other title, who is a prostitute, are all jammed together into a single person. This was done by the early church fathers, and not even in the first century. We're talking about mostly this was the work of St. Augustine, which is the 6th century and later. But people have a misconception about this, which is people think that they turned Mary into a prostitute to make her less important. If you actually read what the early church fathers wrote about her, they hold her in very high regard. Now, the Bible talks about Jesus being a second Adam, because the first Adam screwed everything up. Jesus was the second Adam to wash away the sins of the first. The early church fathers talk about the Magdalene being just as Adam, Jesus was the second Adam, Mary of Magdalene was the second Eve. She was that important. The point of making her, of conflating her with this other Mary, was to increase her importance in the story, not to decrease it.
Okay, so to sort of clarify, because we also touched on this in a previous episode with the whole Eve wasn't the actual first woman. There was Lilith, who was made equal to, with this whole revival as per the framework that you have provided, with Jesus essentially being a second Adam. Would that make essentially Mary Magdalene supposed to be, as far as the scripture is concerned, the balance between the two, the one that was wise and had her own will, but yet was willing to work with, instead of just being off, saying, tell with you and off of doing whatever she wanted? That's
a really interesting thought. I wouldn't say that was probably the intention of Augustine, because the early Christians really weren't big on Lilith.
To be fair, I don't think most people were.
No, well, Lilith largely comes from the Jewish tradition. She's kind of something that got put into Christianity, sort of the way Sir Lancelot got put into the Arthurian legends. He wasn't there originally.
A lot of people were added to
I thought it was Galahad
legends.
that wasn't there originally. Lancelot was.
No, neither of them was.
Lancelot was a French hero. The original Arthurian legends don't mention him at all, because they're Welsh and
English and Scottish
and Pictish. But yeah, Lancelot was
for anybody who was worth a
but Lancelot was a French hero that got shoved in the Romantic
Lancelot,
period.
Galahad, Parsifal,
and the whole
all
Grail,
were added by somebody else.
And the whole Grail quest thing was all done later on.
It fits, so let's hit the Grail too, because it does fit the theme of tonight's show.
No, we are not going code on this, everybody. So don't leave just yet.
We're not going what?
We're not going Da Vinci Code on this crap.
Oh, good God.
And yes, I gave him an aneurysm before the end of the show. My life is complete.
Maybe I need the writing crop for her as well.
There you go.
Just for going there.
Aw, that's so sweet. You must love me.
Oh, wait, she's going to enjoy that too much. We may need to rethink that. And Beth, you do a great job. Yes, we do love you.
Yes.
So, the Da Vinci hoax. Let's be real clear on something. Dan Brown writes fiction. Nothing in his books, including the disclaimer that all the rituals and crap are real, is real. It's all fiction, people.
Yeah.
And it isn't even his idea. There's an older book that came out 10 years or so before the Da Vinci Code, called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, that lays out the whole theory of the bloodline of Christ.
Well, sure.
And he just basically lifted their idea and added some more bullshit.
Well, you take a theory, and you fictionalize it, and you work with it. That's what any good. That's what I do. I take ideas that I find or hear about that intrigue me, and I find a way to work them into fiction.
It worked brilliantly for him. Oh, yeah. The book wasn't very well written. He would not be as famous as he is if it wasn't for the controversy.
Yeah. Oh, no, he managed to get a bestseller out of it, a couple of movies. I mean, he's doing pretty
Illuminati
well.
Conspiracy theories.
Oh, well, the Illuminati theories, abound and have for for so long.
You know, the Illuminati did actually exist at one point.
Oh yeah, a society called the Illuminati, and it had nothing to do with like what people think it does now.
What's actually hilarious is in Secret World they actually combine the actual backstory between the Illuminati and the Templars, and how they like move through history. And the Templars like outright admit, yeah, no, we at one time were actual crusaders that were in the forefront, and our pride whooped our butts, and we're sticking back here. Whereas the Illuminati is essentially, let's poke at it and see what happens, because it's what we do. And then you have the dragon off over in another part of the world that's like, set off this reaction, we're going to see the results. Okay,
the Templars mostly got destroyed because they pissed off a very greedy French king named Philip IV, Philip the Fair.
Yep.
They weren't guilty of any of the nonsense they were accused of. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. And the reality was that the Templars were rich. Philip was broken in debt to them. They refused to let him join the order, and he had basically engineered the assassination of one pope, got his preferred choice put in his place, and created a kangaroo court to get rid of the Templars.
Yep. Like
on
most
Friday,
things,
October 13th.
Yeah. Like most things, it comes down to money.
So, the Grail. Brian's absolutely right. The Grail comes in much later. So, in the Bible, you have the Last Supper. Jesus takes up the cup. You know, this is my blood, drink of it. Which is the entire extent to which the Bible mentions the Grail in any way, shape, or form.
Though it's funny because things like that, that and the bread, had, as a mark against Christians early on, the Romans actually believed these people were being cannibals.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about that, because that was something that always wondered me, is why go that route? Like, why, as a sacrament or whatever, does Jesus say, you know, here, pretend this wine is my blood, and pretend this bread is my, you know, is my body, and eat
It's more
me.
of an energy transference thing, kind of like the drawdowns that I've mentioned in the past.
I guess, but it's like, why not?
I'm not.
I don't know. With all the taboos against cannibalism, I would think that they could come up with a better system for that. Like Jesus could be like, "Hey, drink wine and remember all those awesome times we had." Something a little
level,
easier.
Though, it's actually more profound on a spiritual level. I think was essentially the mindset for when, because again, the exact steps and whatnot weren't actually written down till much later. They were practiced. And who knows what got garbled in the meantime. But on the spiritual level, it's more of share me amongst yourselves and others in either of these fashions to spread.
It was seemed like
Beth gave a better answer than I could have, to be honest.
I was just wondering if you had anything, because that just seemed like, because I mean the eating of someone and taking stuff into it is an old idea. It's, you know, very shamanistic and goes back to ancient, but it's also something that was very much shied away from by that time.
It's one of the
period.
things the Romans got the Christians in trouble for, was the belief that they were practicing cannibalism, and they weren't.
Well, and I'm sure in some cases it was a deliberate misunderstanding. If you have a political enemy, you smear them with whatever you can.
If you look throughout history, there are certain accusations that get made against outsiders. They were made against the Christians by the Romans. They were made against the Jews, both by the Romans and by the Christians and the Nazis
and the Romani.
They were made against the Templars.
Yeah.
Cannibalism is a common one. Worship of demons, of course. Stealing babies, human sacrifice.
Yeah, all the big no-nos that.
And a lot of it was they were just playing stuff that was former in their history or with previous allies that they were no longer allies with, because it was, you know, at least hundreds of years old. Additionally, specifically on cannibalism, in a lot of different cultures, cannibalism itself wasn't very much a common thing. It's kind of like how everybody, when they think of like Aztecs or Mayans, it's like, oh, there was blood sacrifices all the time. It's like, yes, but there was actually a pattern or method to the madness. Not saying it was right in any way.
Oh yeah,
of course.
And
but even to modern
a lot of times
day,
the sacrifices were happy to be
tribe that was still practicing cannibalism even though otherwise they had merged with modern times to a degree.
Yeah.
But there would be like funeral cannibalism as a sort of marker or reminder, and the main reason it stopped was because they had a series where there was numerous deaths happening, and it was only happening amongst the elders, the children, and the women. The middle to younger menfolk were fine. And the reason they found out was because certain parts that people were eating. And again, none of this I am condoning in any
The
format.
brain
I'm
in
just
particular
giving
causes a number of diseases.
Yes.
the brain, the heart, and certain organs. Because the muscles, which had the least amount of taint, was literally given to the menfolk because they were the warriors, they were the protectors. And that would give them essentially more of what they needed nutrient-wise, which was the logic. Again, this is what their logic was.
Well, there's actually a prion disease, very similar to mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jacobs, that is common to cannibalism because of eating the brains.
Yeah, that's what was actually starting to pop up with this. And I don't think it was actually CDC or WHO, but essentially a similar group went out to see what the heck was going on because it was also part of a different study. And when they realized what it was, they gave them the information, and it took like a couple of decades, but they were able to phase it out as part of the tradition.
People
and there
who
wasn't,
eat
you know,
people
So
are the luckiest
and
people.
it's worth mentioning that those people, they weren't going out to kill people to eat them. It was a funeral practice. Your loved one dies, you eat the flesh of the dead as a way of, it was their way of paying respect. It's kind of weird, but they're not
also keeping a piece
horrible
of them
murderers.
with you,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that this
It was
way they
that
never
it was
be
that
forgotten.
idea of spiritual
Exactly.
essence and
Like I said,
transfer.
there's
not
other
condoning it.
traditions that
It's a little weird, but it's not as horrible as, say, Ted Bundy, who killed people so he could eat them.
No,
There's a big difference.
That's Dahmer.
They both did. They both ate their victims.
Bundy, not so much.
He
He was
not
more.
as much, but he did do it.
He was a necrophiliac. He had sex with his
Yeah.
victims. He didn't eat them.
pretty sure.
Are,
he
are,
did.
are you sure that wasn't Gracie
No.
you're thinking of over there?
No, Gacy was different. He didn't really have anything to do
Or was he
with
the one with
his.
the clowns?
He was
He
the
was the
clown.
clowns.
Okay.
Yeah, he just buried his
They were
victims in
pretty
his
much
crawl
right around the
space.
same time, so
Fun-
I get them mixed
Fun
up.
one with Gacy. So a lot of people, when you talk, to get slightly political, when a lot of people talk about serial killers, they tend to think of serial killers as being right wing, particularly because Ted Bundy, one of the worst, was a prominent Republican who had
Yeah.
ties to the.
He may have actually he worked on a gubernatorial campaign
Yes.
for a Republican. He
And
wasn't.
actually wrote prison reform suggestions for them as well.
Oh yeah.
From what I
Like
understand,
actual
like,
reform or
well,
the
yes,
reform?
actual
Well,
like
Bundy-
reasonably good reform.
Bundy had he didn't have a degree, but he went to law
He was
school.
extremely intelligent.
Yeah, he was a very smart man, and actually, scary enough, had he not been caught, like he could have wound up eventually having some kind of political career in California, and that would have been really
So
weird.
on the other side of the political spectrum, you have John Wayne Gacy, the clown guy, who was a Democrat precinct captain
Yeah.
in Texas. In point of fact, one of the great embarrassments in the history of the Secret Service. So whenever someone met, I assume it's still true, but at the time certainly, whenever somebody met with the First Lady or the President, the Secret Service would obviously check them out and then give them a pin to say, yeah, okay, this person's cleared.
Yeah.
There are pictures of John Wayne Gacy with then First Lady Tipper, or not Tipper, what's...
Johnson probably.
No.
No?
Carter's wife.
Oh, Carter, Peggy. I think.
With Peggy Carter
Yeah.
prominently wearing the pin, and the man's a convicted serial killer.
Well, I don't think he was. He wasn't convicted.
Not
then.
at the time, no.
But
no.
before that, he was he had a very clean record. He was well liked. He
Yeah.
was well respected.
Most of them do
Yeah.
because they either covered their tracks, which is usually, especially back then,
I mean-
about 75% of the reason that they couldn't get caught because the forensics weren't there at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
25% of the time it was a lot more profiling. In
But
the
they
worst
al-
way
but they also
possible.
make-
There-
they
that's
also
still
make
an
a
issue, but
lot
it's
of-
nowhere
This
near
is
as
really a
effort.
topic we need
Well,
to dedicate.
you know.
Why don't we make next week about serial killers?
Serial killer
We've
week.
talked about this for so long. I think it's time. Well, yeah.
we keep touching
So the
on
week
it. Yeah.
of Easter, you want to do a serial killer
Damn right.
Why not?
episode. Okay. All right.
So-
cool. I'll set it up.
Holy Grail.
I'm
The
bringing my
first
Bundy
appearance. I'm gonna shoot down the entire Holy Blood, Holy Grail Dan Brown thing in probably less than. And yeah, I'm gonna say less than 5 minutes time.
books. I think you already have.
Well, I'll shoot it down even more simply than that. The
Shoot it
oldest
harder.
known reference. So a central point of the theory is San Grial, is Holy Grail. Sangreal is Holy Blood. So supposedly it was a mistake or it was a deliberate change that they moved the G. But if you go back to the oldest known reference to the Grail, which is the poem Parsifal, which is the 11th century, it's San Gridalis. San Gridalis is basically holy plate.
Yeah.
And in the oldest known Grail story, it's a plate, and every day a dove comes down and lays a communion wafer on the plate, which is then given to the Fisher King because he's been wounded by being stabbed with the spear of Longinus, the spear that stabbed the side of Christ. And the holy wafer is what keeps him alive day to day until someone, in this story being Parsifal, asks the proper question, which in this case is, whom does the Grail serve?
Yep.
The original story doesn't mention Jesus at well,
yeah.
to a point it does, but doesn't mention the Grail having any connection to Jesus at all. The thing is, the story of Parsifal was unfinished, and later Arthurian writers tried to basically picked up the idea and ran with it, particularly, of course,
Yeah.
Sir Thomas Malory.
Yeah. Well,
who's
the
an
French
interesting character
especially
himself.
loved. Yeah, the French loved, and also Geoffrey of Monmouth
Yeah.
played a big part in shaping and politicizing the Arthurian legend.
Yeah, but he didn't. The Grail was Monmouth was before the Grail.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He's
He
one of
was,
the first.
he was the earliest one. He was the one that made
At least a vague attempt to be historical.
made the Plantagenets
Yeah.
the inheritors of Arthur's bloodline and whatnot. I have a friend who writes and actually has like a degree in medieval literature and has studied all this stuff. If I can convince her to come on, I think that'd be awesome.
I was gonna say, yeah, get her, bring her on.
Yeah, she's a writer friend of mine.
Cool. Yeah, let's do that.
She'd be really useful.
If by any chance she's listening, yes, please, we want to have you on.
Yes. She's scared, actually. She won't watch the show because it deals with the paranormal. Yeah, she is.
I get that a lot.
She is terrified. Like, I've mentioned it, and I've said, no, you should watch this episode. All we do is talk to a writer. I said, it's fine. She's like, nope.
No ghosts.
She's like, I don't want to hear about ghosts. I don't want to hear about demons. She's like,
and yet she deals with medieval literature, which is chock full with all. Really?
Well, yeah. Well, because
I'm
guess.
confused now.
Well, it's that thing in certain context. It's different. It's different reading about stories from hundreds of years ago as opposed to, my grandmother is possessed by a demon.
Yeah. Well, also remember one of my favorites, the not haunted story is the Navy SEAL who freaked out over the raccoons.
Yeah.
So
Or the sad little house in Scotland that does not have a ghost.
Oh yes, the house
This
that
is
like
the
the
saddest
bogle.
horror story.
But no, for those listeners who are wondering, I had a friend who was an investigator in Texas, had to investigate a house by at night.
You've told this story.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know, but it's a good story. And we may have new listeners who haven't heard it before.
We're gonna waste our extra time on this.
What do you want to talk about?
Easter? Well, I don't know. Easter, maybe.
Is there anything?
Jesus.
Okay, the agnostic wants to talk about Jesus. I think this show is getting to him. And we've got so far off topic, and now you're trying to get us on point.
Okay,
Wow, Brian, are you trying to avoid a hot date tonight?
no, call in. Here's our topic
Brian!
for discussion.
Beth broke Brian.
She
You just started stuttering,
She just
dude.
confused me. I was like, what? Why
She
would you
broke
even?
you.
Why would you even think that? But no. So Jesus, vampire, zombie, or lich?
Liches weren't part of are pretty much an invention of Dungeons and Dragons.
Ah,
And zombie really doesn't fit either.
No.
It was essentially a catch-all as far as lich when it came to necromancy of some kind.
Well, the word lich
Well, it was like a
basically
witch.
means a dead body. That's what the word originally means.
No, I understand, but the way that they use it as a
It was like a
separator
dead
was essentially a
wizard.
catch-all for any mystical, still conscience.
Well, yeah,
undead.
there are
There's
certainly
many of them, but still.
influences that impacted the D&D lich, but by and large, the lich, as everyone thinks of it, was invented by Dungeons and Dragons.
okay. Here's one that you could actually get behind. Stoker, one of the main one of the main vampire writers to really put into place the whole you die, you come back exactly 3 nights later. Do you think he was sort of slipping in a little Christian, little Jesus reference
I think he was.
with that? Because I mean, we know that he was a Christian.
Well, it makes sense, especially with the BS storyline that they put in the whole Dracula 2000 series. No, seriously, from the second one on, it was complete BS, and I laughed the entire time.
Well, yes.
But
There's some great scenes in the second one. I'm not saying it's a great movie.
Yes.
This is true. The second one had some great scenes.
All of them
Bullet
have
time
like one
counting
yes.
the seeds was awesome.
That was fantastic. That was the best part of the whole movie. I
No,
loved it.
My
I'm
favorite
trying
one
to not
actually-
to in that speed is also awesome.
Actually, using that particular mechanic in, as stated on when we did our Halloween episode, I find Bram Stoker to be an absolute hack. If I could go back in time in a TARDIS, I would literally be busting, his cojones to make sure that he didn't reproduce, and hopefully get there before he had a chance to. This is how much I hate him. I'm sorry, Kevin. The look on your face.
You're just wrong. I'm sorry. You're just objectively wrong.
That's not even objective. That is your opinion, sir.
You keep saying Bram Stoker when you clearly mean Anne Rice.
No.
No, you know what? They have their nuances, their moments. I will grant this. However, the biggest Mary Sue self-insert Gary Stu style ever was Bram Stoker. However, the 3-night mechanic, essentially, if we're speaking in gamer terms, that he had slipped in based off of Christianity.
Well, because I'm thinking because it doesn't show up a lot in folklore, so
he inserted a bunch of things
the
based
best
on Christianity.
utilization I've ever seen of that in like modern vampire writing, actually, is a gentleman by the name of Michael Romkey.
I know Michael Romkey. Yeah,
and his
read
mechanic
his
was
stuff.
essentially the only way that itself would literally work is if you were bitten the 3 consecutive nights because of the fever that came with it, because it was literally a physical transformation. You didn't actually die. You still had a pulse, technically speaking.
There is actually another explanation, which is actually in occultism. So depending on the occultist you ask and tradition you ask, we have multiple, they call them bodies, etheric body, astral body, so on. When you die, your physical body dies. You still have your etheric body, which has to die before your astral body can pass. Your soul basically can move on to the next life. It's commonly believed among some occultists that it takes 3 days for the etheric body to die, and that's why you get a lot of stories of ghosts that happen within the first 3 days after a person's death, and then they're never seen again. This is why one of the reasons it's been traditional trying to get a funeral done very quickly. It's also thought that ghosts are basically people who somehow accidentally get stuck and their body maintains itself. Vampires on this school of thought, well, your etheric body is going to run out of it requires energy. It's going to run out of energy. You have to get energy from somewhere.
For the blood is
Vampirism.
the life.
And for that matter, ghosts. To some
Another
extent,
quote that
also
comes from the
feed like
Bible.
that. Yes.
Dealing with blood that informed a lot of vampire stuff.
Which is also why in Judaism, eating blood is a major taboo.
Yes.
So
there are no kosher vampires.
Also, and there's also no Jehovah's Witnesses vampires either, I would assume, because one of my many sticking points with the Jehovah's Witness religion, to be generous, is that they do not allow their members to get blood transfusions even to save their own lives, and that children have died over this.
Yeah, that's a problem. I also don't like the no birthdays and no celebrations.
The shunning bothers me more than the no birthdays and celebrations thing. The reasons for the no birthdays is basically there's only 2 times the Bible ever mentions birthdays, and something unlucky happens on both of them. And there's also the whole, glorifying the self, and I just don't agree with it.
Yeah.
But specifically, especially there's a really great concept in Judaism that I wish more Christians would adopt. Prishna Negrev is what it's called, which is basically under Jewish law, and this is the Hasidic Orthodox, most hardline Jews you will find on the planet. If it's a matter of life or death, do what you need to survive.
Which
You know,
is sensible.
If a under Jewish law, if a Jewish man is starving, and the only food available to him is pork, it would be a sin not to eat the pork, because it's more important to preserve your life.
Right, which makes sense.
You know, Jesus, and you know, here's the kicker: Jesus brought this up because the Pharisees, you know, gave him a hard time for healing the sick on the Sabbath day. It's like, on the Sabbath day, would you not feed yourself? You know,
Well,
and
it all comes down to you're not supposed to work. You're supposed to sit there and essentially be fasting.
yeah.
To a degree. So essentially, so you're literally not supposed to do anything but contemplate on.
But Jesus,
Right.
specifically in the light of reducing suffering, made the and in preservation of life, that no, that rules out the window. Life is more important.
No, which is absolutely true.
Yeah, and again, widely accepted by Jews today. It's like, no, they will work. You know, and even to their credit, you know, even sometimes when it isn't a life or death situation, you know, doctors in Jewish law, as I understand it, are generally allowed to work on the Sabbath day, even if it isn't to save a life, just to relieve suffering.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's one of the things that, like, in general, you know, it has some odd points, but in general, Judaism is a very pragmatic religion in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And I respect that about it. It's like, no, go ahead and eat the bloody pork if it's a matter of life or death. God will say it's okay.
It's all we got. It's all we have.
It's okay. Eat the bacon.
Yeah.
Eat
Actually,
the
there-
bacon.
Actually, something
Go for it.
hilarious. And this happened a while ago because, as we all know, there's numerous sects of Judaism.
Yep.
There was one. There's one particular sect which is so stringent to the laws and keeping kosher and everything like that. A study came out that in salmon, there is such a minute, tiniest, bittiest chance that you could possibly catch a particular parasite. And there were studies and stuff done on it, but it was literally so minute that it might as well not have even existed. This news got to the head rabbi of said very stringent sect. And so he had turned around and proposed that because of this and because this now makes it unclean, whereas otherwise they were all originally taught that this was a clean fish, you could have it whenever, however. And he pretty much said, we need to ban this now for the safety of others. Again, minute chance that, again, shouldn't even
But it
exist.
was still too much.
The rabbis at the table looked at each other, turned to him, and said, you push this through to make it into law, we will all convert to Catholicism. Now, this is several decades old story, or at least a couple decades old.
Yeah.
But it's like, I heard this and I'm starting going, wait, really? They all pretty much said we're all leaving and
We're
taking
gonna
our
walk
flocks
out
with
over
you.
this.
with
Well, I
us
mean, a lot
because to hell with you.
of the Jewish, and I'm by no means an expert, but a lot of the kosher and Jewish dietary restrictions come from way back when eating pigs was not necessarily a safe, option all the time.
Or something.
So-
There's a
sure,
severe,
yeah.
pretty
There- there
nasty.
But
Well, also
Yeah.
keep in mind, it didn't. It back
the
then,
back
especially,
half
it
of
didn't
the beef,
keep
not so
well
great.
to begin with,
Yeah.
even if it was cooked.
Yeah.
Well,
But I
I mean,
mean,
number
even
of
then, it also it didn't. I'm not sure if like they actually jerked their stuff back then, their meat back then. Fine, I'll say it. Phrasing. Boom. But,
That's the correct term for it.
well, yeah, right. But but as far as processes, otherwise, they had that particular step because they had noticed patterns. It's also, like, as far as I am aware, the reason that the whole circumcision thing came around and everything when the baby was born was so that there was less places for dirt and stuff to hide to cause infections.
Well, yeah, it was originally again an idea of a sanitary
And Judaism,
health.
and it's one of the things that actually saved a lot of Jewish lives in the Middle Ages, because their stringent rules about sanitation kept them alive during the plague years. One, because, two things in it. One, the initial introduction of the plague to Europe was through rodents, possibly cats, possibly rats, possibly guinea pigs. I've seen debate about that. But in most of Christian Europe, cats were taboo because of the association with witchcraft. The Jews didn't have that, so that killed the original introduction. But the main way that the plague spread was through what's known as the pneumonic plague, which spreads just like the flu, coughing, sneezing. And where Christianity at the time, there were even almost prohibitions against bathing and things of that nature. In Judaism, you were clean.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't even so much prohibitions
Yeah.
on bathing and whatnot, because
There was to a point in some
Well, they
areas.
thought that it
depends
made
on
you
where
sicker.
were.
Granted.
Yeah.
Well,
And
to
in
be
most
fair,
cases, the quality of the water was pretty awful. So
Well, looking
they
at
had
the
a point.
Thames back in the day, yeah, let's talk about
They-
it. That
they
was
kinda
the
had a-
industrial revolution.
they had a point.
But-
They weren't out of their mind.
well, here's the thing too. It wasn't just the cats that they were killing off left and right and leaving the rodents to go for it. It was also the dogs, because anybody who was getting sick, they had noticed also they had a stray dog in the area, or there was
Yeah.
a dog in general in the area.
Didn't
so
fleas
the animals
have
who were
something?
chasing
The
off.
fleas introduced it through the rodents. The point
Okay.
with the cats is the cats killed the bloody rats.
Yeah.
Well, so did some of the dogs too, because
True.
there were also like rat catchers and things like that. Some of them would use cats, others would use dogs, and similar things. Anything that was seen as an animal that you could easily catch, which would be a larger four-legged animal.
Yeah.
was
Well,
put to death.
there's a specific breed of dog known as a rat
Yeah.
terrier that is used.
The
because
inherent
it's
tragedy
small.
of this story is that Christians in the Middle Ages, being the dumbasses they were,
Yeah.
I had a
saw
problem
that
with
the
it.
Jews were not suffering the plague as severely as the Christians, and assumed that it was some sort of diabolical plot by the Jews, and started executing Jews for it.
Well, also remember at that time was around when any documentation that was left over between the Byzantine Empire and Roman era Christianity was that a lot of the old medicine books got destroyed, because one of the big things at the time, especially for the earlier plague, not so much the later plague that hit, but their main cure for everything was you need to pray harder. Put this Bible in the book with the baby, it'll be fine.
Well, also
This is failing because you don't have enough faith. It was more faith healing than actually doing something, and herbalists and things like that were very quickly being outlawed, especially if they were women, and it was usually the women who were doing this.
It's
We're doing the
a little
actual, like...
more complicated. The other problem you
Well,
have
there
is the
was a-
destruction of Rome by the Vandals, the Goths.
Yeah, the burning of the
And
Library of Alexandria.
There weren't a whole, the problem you
Alexander
have
was kind of a different thing.
Well, a different thing happened, but that also caused a general lack of knowledge, and there was a
Yeah.
But the thing is, the
suspicion
plague
about
didn't only just hit
knowledge.
Europe, because it also hit the Middle East first.
Yeah,
Well, here's the
They still
thing,
had
but
the
they
concept
they
of
kept
kept their
laws.
medical records.
Yeah,
But then that was based off of the Greeks.
but a lot of that stopped in the 12th century, which is the other problem, because up until like the 12th century, the Muslim part of the world was actually very pro-science and an area of learning, and then the one imam, the one or caliph, I don't remember which title it is, but the one ruler stepped in and said, nope, 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 and put an end to it, which led to, with all due respect to Islam, the Middle East in general is not necessarily famous for its technological revolutions today.
Yeah,
Um,
which is a shame because
they used to be,
Are
but
you
past
talking
they
about
were.
the establishment of the first caliphate?
might be. I don't remember off
essentially,
the top of my head.
I think, but I'm not sure because I'm not that. Up
I just
on
know
their history
around the
bit.
12th century there was the one major Muslim leader, cleric and leader, that basically said no and put a kibosh on the whole scientific advancement that was going on in the
this is
survival
my
of
general
records.
problem with religion. Throughout history, is it's usually been an enemy of knowledge and progress, and
That's not entirely fair. Again,
yeah.
we lost.
Well, I said generally, but in a lot of places, in a lot of cases,
but it's not a fair. I've heard this all the time, and there's huge problems with that statement. For one, keep in mind we lost the records of the Romans, not because of the Christians, because of the various pagan barbarian hordes that sacked Rome, who weren't really interested in books. The reason why any of those texts survived in Western Europe is that the Christian monks kept them and kept copying them. There's a huge amount of knowledge of the ancient world that we only have because priests, monks,
the Irish.
the Irish in particular, but studiously, carefully copied these things down. The only reason, Christian monks are the only reason we have Beowulf.
Yeah, but they could also. There were also other instances where they had knowledge was available from like say the further east, and the Christians of Europe rejected it because it came from
people
the
that they were at
Muslims.
war with.
Yeah, so they weren't going to take any kind
Which
of
has political
knowledge.
saying that's religion is unfair. There's a huge political implication of the fact that from almost the first contact between the Muslims and the Christians, the two were at war with each other. The first invasion of Europe by the Muslims was in the 6th century.
Saying if people, you see people suppressing knowledge and whatnot, it's usually.
And you also see it they do as much to they've done historically done as much to promote knowledge as they've done to suppress it. Some often more. Case in point, and this is a really good example of something people get wrong. Galileo, and what Galileo got in trouble for, and what actually was happening. And the story that most people have heard is wrong, and fundamentally wrong. So here's what happens. First of all, there's this dude by the name of Copernicus. Copernicus was a philosopher, because really scientist didn't, as a title, didn't exist at the time. That didn't come in as a concept until much later. That you were called natural philosophers, who proposed the idea of what we know as the heliocentric model, that the sun is the center of the universe, everything else revolves around the sun. This was widely rejected, not just by religious people, but by the other academics of the time. And contrary to popular belief, the prominent theory was not that the Earth was the center of the universe and everything revolved around the Earth. It was that the sun revolved around the Earth and everything else revolved around the sun. So Copernicus suggests this. Copernicus got into no trouble whatsoever. He wasn't jailed, he wasn't imprisoned, he wasn't executed, he wasn't tortured. It was just, okay, you have this idea, that's nice. Moving on. Now Galileo comes forward and publishes the same theory. The only difference...
3-minute warning, guys.
Okay. The main difference is that Galileo had new evidence. Specifically, observations he made with his telescope of the moons of Jupiter and the way shadows passed across them that made him realize, wait, things aren't happening the way people think they are. Galileo published his findings. The first mistake Galileo made is he published theory as if it was established fact. Infuriated the academic community, who went to the Pope. It's like, you got to do something about this guy. He can't prove his theories. He can't publish them as if they were fact. What did the Pope do? The Pope invited him to come to Rome and present his findings. He actually became friends with the Pope. He became friends with a number of important cardinals, friends with a bunch of Jesuits who were the main scientists, many of the main scientists of the day. And he went back and it just got worse. And finally, he's called in front of the Inquisition the first time, and they tell him, okay, keep publishing your theory. What we want you to do, in fact, the Pope Innocent XII particularly asked him to do, is write a book that presents both ideas and the evidence for both ideas. So he did. It was the book called Dialogue Concerning the Chief Two World Systems, which he presents as an argument between the academic and the fool. The academic, of course, being his theory, the fool being everyone else's. So this is mistake number 2. Mistake number 3 is he then proceeds to quote the Pope, several important Jesuits, and several cardinals out of context through the fool, making them all look stupid. Which is the point that the Inquisition went, yeah, come here a minute. And sentenced him. He was never tortured. He was sentenced to life in prison. His daughter, herself a Catholic nun, interceded with him for him, and literally the next day, his life in prison was turned into a house arrest. He spent the rest of his life living in his villa. He was allowed to have visitors. He was allowed to have parties. He was allowed to travel as long as he was supervised. He was allowed to continue his work. In fact, possibly the single greatest book that he ever wrote, which was The Two New Sciences, which cemented his place as the father of physics, was written while he was under house arrest. And the kicker is, he continued. The other thing they did aside from sentence him to house arrest is that they told him they couldn't publish the Dialogue Concerning the Chief Two World Systems anymore. He did it anyway, and the church ignored it. They knew what he was doing. He was doing it mostly in countries that were not especially Catholic at the time. And the church just went, yeah, okay, you're flouting the rule we gave you. We don't care. Galileo was not persecuted for his crime. And there's a whole lot more we could say on this, and we'll have to do a topic about the relationship between religion and science at some point in the future. But at this point, it's time to wrap things up.
Yes.
We've already had our station owner, Gene, be very gracious in giving us a full extra half hour. So it's time to get going. Folks, I want to thank you all for listening in. Remember to tune in next week, 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Hamilton Radio. You can hear us on YouTube and on Facebook. Remember to check out our Patreon, www.patreon.com/demonology, www.patreon.com/demonology. We really need the support. If anybody has a business they want to advertise, please check it out or get a hold of me through Facebook. You look up the Paranormal Encyclopedia on Facebook and YouTube. But that's going to do it for tonight. Everyone, this is Kevin Mears saying good night and God bless.
And I'm Batman.
No, you're not.
Say goodnight, Brian.
Yes, I am.
Brian.
Good night, Brian.
Good enough. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Always wrap the joke back around at the end.
Of course.